or so was focusing on earthworms. And why am I not be able to? I am. Okay, so first of all, I just want to acknowledge that a lot of this work was obviously collaborative works with people from the U.S. Forest Service, the NRCS, my students, a lot of people, collaborators at SERC. I learned a lot about soils and site history. And essentially, I'm going to talk about 5 main topics, which is listed here. So I will first start with talking about land use history, just soils basically, and then you will see how it connects to earthworms. I guess I don't have to spell out why soils are important, but I always like to show something that sort of summarizes all the kind of functions and ecosystem services that healthy soils can provide us. And a lot of it relates to climate and biology, obviously growing our crops and so on, but also there is archaeology. Soils are important when we want to build things. Soils are important to regulate and detoxify our environment and so on and so forth. Now, in natural conditions, these are the 5 major drivers that we consider to be soil forming factors. What that means is that if you are in a certain place, Maryland or the tropics or the Sahara Desert, and you know what the parent material that the soil was forming in, you know if you are on a slope or the top of the hill or in a valley, you know the climate, you know how long this has been going on, and you know what kind of things living or used to live on that soil, you can pretty well predict a lot of things about your soil conditions, okay? So you can say something about how well it drains, how much organic matter is in it, what's the pH, that kind of thing. Of course, humans change all that, sometimes very visibly, as I'm illustrating this with some of these photographs, sometimes indirectly polluting the soil or managing the soil, many different ways. And those human activities, which I'm interested in urban environment, agricultural, and these forests that I'm going to talk about, changing the soil conditions. So in order to understand, if we go to some place, especially if we know humans has been there, in order to understand what we see, we need to know the site history. I didn't realize that until I came to the US, but that's one of the most important things we have to sort of ask, what was there before? Okay, was it affected by humans? We can see if it affects, if it is affected now, but what was the history of that site? And so in this context, there are 2 types of history we are interested in, sort of long-term history, the geological history, and the shorter human history. And I'll get to the geological history in a second. But for what's important for us is this history in the eastern United States of deforestation and then secondary forest growth. So if you, for instance, look a little closer or more closely in our region, you can see yellow is cropland, green is forest, that over time, at some point, especially in the turn of the 19th to 20th century, really forest didn't exist. Everything was some kind of agricultural field. And then gradually, some of those got reforested. Some of those obviously were taken over by urban suburban development. But the forests that we're looking at today are not the forests that were, covering the land pre-colonial times. So these soils that underneath these forests are actually preserving some of these past human activities. And so one of the questions we were asking, what are those differences, or how can we sort of trace that back? So as Bonmin mentioned, I have been working at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Probably most of you have been there. If not, please go visit. It's a beautiful place. It's down just south of Annapolis, about an hour drive from here. And the seemingly sort of uniform forest cover is actually a patchwork of different forest stands which differ in age, tree composition, tree age, and a lot of other things. And some of these differences are due to past land use history. I also want to mention this is one of the oldest farms, oldest agriculture areas on the eastern United States. So even in the 1600s, this was already farmed. There was farming going on here. So in order to look at these forested patches, first we had to at least somewhat, to some extent, reconstruct what was there before. So we were looking at old maps, oral histories, all kinds of documents that could tell us what sort of human activities were taking place in some of these forests. And so what this time scale is what we call, let's call pre-colonial to present, spans over, let's say, 300 years, almost 400 years. And so we're looking at the soils, and we would like to know whether or not all of these activities that we try to reconstruct have some footprint in the soil system. Based upon that, we were able, and also forest age, of course, and this past history, just divide these forest patches that we were interested in. Some, not too much, what we call uncut. Essentially, this was never disturbed, never logged by people. There were other forest patches which we call old. So these are at least 150 years old, older, which were logged. And then there is something that we call young. I mean, it's not so young, but sort of 80-ish, which where there was a lot of agriculture up to like 80-ish years ago, and it was a dairy farm. So there are all these human activities. And of course, these forests are at the moment experiencing other type of human influence. So I'm gonna talk about this uncut, old, and young forest soil, just show you a few data of how the soils in these different three categories differ. So young is the darkest color. And so all I want to say is that there are differences in these forest patches. Young forests are denser. The surface soil, and surface is just like 4 inches, 10 centimeters or so, or even less, denser. So the density is higher. It has more calcium. It's less acidic. It has less aluminum. And then the carbon content, is more or less the same. The other thing that's very different between this old, young wood and uncut is where the what so-called B horizon is. So this is kind of a typical drawing of soil horizons. B horizon is the one where the clay particles, which are constantly being washed down by the rain and so on, accumulate. So what you can see here, this is surface. What you can see here that in the young forest, the B horizon is much closer to the surface than in these uncut, not disturbed forests. And partially this is due to the fact that, of course, as a result of long-term agriculture, the top layers eroded, and the forests not having forests, these horizons couldn't build up, or there hasn't been enough time to build up. Okay, so that's really the surface. Now let's look at what's happening in deeper soil. So this is a typical uncut forest soil profile. And so what you can see here is on the top of it, the top, let's say 10 centimeters or so, you have what we call a leaf litter layer, and underneath a rich duff layer, organic layer, which is full of fungi and smaller organisms that feed on these fungi or feed on each other and so on. And below that is this mineral layer, which essentially has no organic matter or very little organic matter. If you look at an older forest soils, it's a bit more, the boundaries are not so sharp, but you can still that this bottom layer is different from the top. in these young forests, it's pretty much completely mixed up. And so we think that at least partially, this is due to the fact that these young forests have a lot more earthworms, non-native earthworms in them, much higher abundance, which are constantly mixing up these mineral and organic layers. So this is the segue to the earthworms. So earthworms are, again, it's a very important group. They do all kinds of things. And I'm going to talk about whether this is all good or not, or want to know what your opinion is. Essentially, they obviously affect the physical, chemical, and biological properties. I'm just listing a few. We like earthworms. We want to use the earthworms in our gardens and put some earthworm poop in our vegetable and flower places. Globally, it is, as far as we know, about 5,000 people of 5,000 species. There's probably a lot more, like with everything else, there's unexplored areas. And about 80 of them is what we call peregrine earthworms. Those are often called synanthropic species, which move around with people, they get introduced, and some of them now everywhere. And so I also want to show you that, somebody mentioned about the glowing worms. They're not all of them are, pinkish or sort of pale color. They can have very bright colorations as well. So this is an example of these peregrine earthworms, this subset. In the bottom are species of the what I call first earthworm wave of earthworm invasion. So these are European earthworms. This second group is what we call the second wave, and these are the jumping worms. Somebody also talked about that. Okay, so we're speaking of large earthworms. So maybe people in Australia would argue, but anyway, this species is among the largest one. This earthworm lives in wetland. These ones live in South America. These photos were taken in Ecuador. That's my former professor. So yeah, they can be really large, and in fact, they can make a meal when it comes to that. I also want to mention that earthworms are not the same. Obviously, they differ in color, in size, and what they do. So some of them only live on the surface and feeding on leaf litter. Some of them, like these ones, that's the common nightcrawler, builds these long vertical permanent burrows and then moves up and down. These are super important to mixing up, bringing up mineral soil and bringing down organic matter. And some of them constantly just live in deeper layer. They never come up to the surface. Or this is one of the largest native earthworm, Eisenoides lundbergi. It's kind of a bluish color. That's more frequently found in wetlands. So there are native earthworms in North America, not very well known. So this 100 described species is probably a small subset. It's not very well studied. And this is why it's relatively easy to dig around here and find a species new to science. And these are two species that we found new to science in Plumbers Island and the other one in Pennsylvania. But you could, it's not unlikely to find other species simply because they just haven't been studied enough. But most of the attention here is paid to these non-native earthworms. And so again, as I mentioned, sorry, there are two groups, the European and the Asian non-native worms. So, excuse me, as far as we know, of 32 species and 16 of these, but numbers could change. So let me talk about the first wave of earthworm invasion first. So again, this is a family called Lumbricidae. And so the species of Lumbricidae came from Europe. And those of you who attended the last isopod talk, you might remember a slide, something like that. Generally speaking, these are the three ways species were historically, soil invertebrates as generally were introduced to North America or other places as well. The most important being ship ballast, soil as ship ballast. So a lot of the time people ask me, how do we know if a species is native or non-native? So there are several ways, and this is where I come to this figure that I showed you. This is the last glacial lines. This is the last ice age where the ice sheet came down. And when you look at native species distributions in North America, they do not cross or just barely cross this glacier boundary. And the reason for that is because they are very slow dispersers. So even if they were here, which we really don't know what was here because they don't fossilize very well, they have not made it back beyond this limit. The non-native species, on the other hand, as you can see, they are doing very well north of this line. In fact, they're doing very well because they didn't, when they got introduced, they didn't have any competition. So there's no equivalent organisms, and they had all these amazing food, leaf litter in the forest, leaf litter, and so on. So they were doing very well. So that's one sign. The other one is when you have a species which have a disjoint in area of distribution, such as this one, because what that indicates is that there were several introduction from the West Coast and the East Coast, as I mentioned, mostly was happening as ship ballast. The third way, of course, is doing some molecular work on them, which is what we did. So, and we were able actually to show that some of the species that people thought that came from the European wave of invasion, are actually much closer relatives to the native species here. So most likely they were introduced from North America to Europe and then to a lot of other places. So the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, where I mentioned I do a lot of my work, has all of these three categories: native, European, and Asian species. But what I want you to point out, sorry, is that how quickly these Asian species appeared. This is what we were recording 2007, and 4 years later, there were a lot of Asian species in there as well. I'll get back to that in a second. So what do they do? So most of earthworm ecological activity or the consequences of having large, highly abundant earthworm assemblages in a forest certainly has to do with feeding and then movement and feeding. So they definitely devour most of the leaf litter. So once earthworms appear in a place, first of all, they get rid of that duff layer that I showed you. They also eat the leaf litter. So we did this experiment at SERC with these leaf litter bags, left them out for a year. And what you can see here is in the uncut forest where there were no earthworm, after a year, about 50% of these leaves remain. But in the other two forests where they are earthworm, essentially they ate everything. They do have an effect, or we think they are affecting native orchid diversity. What we noticed is that young forests do not have essentially any native orchids. So we did some experiments with orchid seeds, which are tiny, so they can feed on them, and that resulted in the poop essentially have much less viable seeds. The other problem is, again, this mixing, so they taking it down deeper layers. Orchid seeds need certain special fungi that form an association, and these fungi only live on the higher, very close to the soil surface. The other thing is that, again, relates to this mixing. So here, where there are no earthworms, most of the carbon is stored in this upper layer, this duff layer and leaf litter layer, and not much in here. So this is what I'm showing. This is surface, go deeper, and it's much more evenly distributed in places where you have abundant earthworms. other soil properties that can be affected are, I mentioned bog density. So this is a study that we did just around Baltimore in rural, suburban, and urban forest. And the more earthworms you had, the denser the soil became, which is contrary what we think or what we would expect. Not surprisingly, there were less litter and less carbon on the soil surface. So this is just sort of a diagram that will summarize what I just told you. So when you have a forest that evolved without earthworms, you have this duff layer, and that's also relates to that the decomposition doesn't, it's not as fast. So you have this partially decomposed organic matter, all these fungi, all these little nematodes, small arthropods, and things like that. Also, you have an understory vegetation which might depend on that, either because the seeds need this environment to germinate, and or because they need this fungal environment to form mycorrhizal associations. So the earthworms comes in, ate up all the duff layer, mix up everything, and so the habitat and the resources for these organisms will disappear, which then leads to decreased diversity of these soil invertebrates. So yes, we do want them in our gardens. We definitely think they do a lot of good. But it really depends on the question you're interested in. So at SERC, if you take a picture in June, this is how the forest will look like. There's essentially nothing on it. You can see all of these is just petioles and veins of the leaves that they essentially devoured. Okay, so these are the European worms, and I usually say that they have been here for a long time. They deserve a green card, and we can't do anything about this. So this other second wave of earthworm invasion is definitely a more recent event. Not that recent, but it's, let's say, 20th century. So these earthworms are coming from Asia. Many of them are, or the most important ones are native to Japan, but they come from other places as well. Jumping worms is a common name, obviously, that, or we call them ferretinoids for the lack of better expression. It's a completely different family, very different natural history. As of we have about 1,000 described species. So this is a group that's definitely has very much more unexplored, I should say, than the Lumbricidae family I just talked to you about. In some cases, so they are now in every region, every continent, mostly introduced. And in some places, like these two species live close to volcanic calderas in extremely high temperature and crazy high CO2 concentration. So while we have the first records of them, early 20th century, it's really people started to pay attention in the past, I would say 2 decades, to this group because, because we started to noticing them in our backyards because of their kind of, that's why they call jumping worms, the way they move, and they also called snake worms and all kinds of other names. And this is a group of earthworms which is now invading again forests. And of course, our backyards are full of them. And to the point when they are concerned, there are lots of concern. And in some states, they have reached the pest status and regulated as much as people can. So again, in an unconfirmed tale is that one of them, Amintas hupeyensis, which you can recognize because it's actually bright green, it's not pink, might have come with the cherries that were planted in the Potomac after the Second World War, because that's where they were originating from. So I mentioned it is a concern, so you can go and just Google them in probably every state. The extensions put these various warnings together, the fact that they are here, and what can we do about it? I think that's the question that goes with it. Among the 16 species, and might be more, 3 are really a major concern, 2 of which are very big. And I'm just showing you the distribution in their native Japan. And this paper was written a few years ago, so the record of that at the time, I'm sure people have a lot more record now. Notice that we are at the same range of latitudinal range, so they are doing very well. People were thinking, oh, well, it's going to be very cold in Canada and so on and so forth. Now they are there and moving forward. And again, just to illustrate how fast this can happen, this is one of our forested sites at SERC, and so we did a grid sampling of all the earthworms, and so in 4 years, you could see they are coming and becoming a lot more common. One of the problem is identification. They are much more difficult to identify than the European worms, and that's partially because external identification happens by looking at the reproductive organs, and many of them do not have them because they are parthenogenetic. So essentially the individual is just cloning itself. And so all we can say is the jumping worm. We can say if it's an adult or a juvenile, but it's not easy. But we put together a relatively simple pictorial guide that can help people who are interested in knowing what species they're looking at. So one thing that we can that helps us is looking at cocoon size. So out of those 2 species that I just showed you, out of the 3 species, there are 2 here, I'm sorry. And you can see that the cocoons are very different. They produce tiny cocoons, so these are very small things. And so obviously people will not go and sift through the soil just to know what kind of cocoons have. They produce a ton of cocoons, and as you can see, they survive very well, which is important because half of the year they are present in our environment as cocoons. So really these cocoons, they are annuals, which is not the case in their native habitat. And the other thing I want to mention, there were all these dots in Japan, so which means that they are everywhere, but they're never abundant. So here we see them, huge numbers. Over in Japan, there are other species, other native species in the forest. So these species mostly occur in small ditches or disturbed areas, but they never sort of dominate the forest floor or other habitats. Anyway, so they will be starting to hatch. We start to see them in April. Early April, they are about an inch long or a little bit shorter, but then you can see them, wiggling in your mulch or the leaf litter. And then they start growing and they reach maturity or midsummer. They get bigger and bigger, and some of them are really big. And they start producing cocoons. Of course, these are hatching and they're growing. And by end of October, early November, they die. They disappear, they die. And so they overwinter as cocoons. And this is how their life cycle is in the Eastern US. So we know a lot less about them, obviously. But one thing that we know, one thing that they share in common, that they devour leaf litter. So they eat up everything. But the one thing that's very different, and it's significant from the European earthworms, is they deposit their cast or they poop as loose granular structure on the soil surface. It looks like something that you buy as a bag of earthworm cast. It's a very loose, dark thing. And so the problem is that it's very loose. It doesn't, mix, the organic matter doesn't mix into the soil. So it's a lot more easily erodable, which is you essentially losing a lot of carbon and other nutrients from your system. So this is just a soil profile where you have abundant of them. This is from where Loch Raven, around Loch Raven Reservoir. There's a lot of them. This is early fall. And as you can see, even though there's a lot of them, they're not mixing anything. So this top layer is essentially their cast, and then below is just mineral soil. Okay, so there's a lot of unanswered. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of questions we can ask and we could study about them. So for instance, we don't know how they interact really. There are some laboratory experiment about competition and so on. In my country, they only occur in greenhouses. And so it's a question of why is this the case? And whether or not we know stories when species, establish themselves in greenhouses, but they don't do very well outside the greenhouses. There are some records is that they reach a huge population and then suddenly the whole population collapse and they disappear. So anyway, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And the first one is obviously where they are. So I'm gonna pitch a little bit of a project that I'm involved here. So we're trying to figure out and get the community participate in data collection. One way of doing that is iNaturalist. And we have a project called Earthworm in the Mid-Atlantic. The problem, of course, with iNaturalist and earthworms is that people start identifying them and most of the identifications are incorrect. But from the photos, if it's a reasonably good photo, at least we can tell whether or not it's the jumping worm, one of the jumping worm species, or one of the European species. But certainly the iNaturalist is full of very bad photos and very bad identification. The other one is more direct. So we have a little earthworm, I guess we don't call that citizen science now, community science project, in which we put together little kits, so which has mustard powder, some ethanol, if somebody doesn't mind killing them, some instruction of what to do, and we ask people to collect earthworms, send it back to us, and that way we can identify them correctly, and a little questionnaire about land use and things like that. And so just to summarize, again, so when we start digging and talking about soil, we should remember that soil is essentially a collection of footprints of past events and present management and human activities. So I think that's important to understand and interpret those data. Out of the two groups, now we're really mostly talking about jumping worms as a pest or major concern, and I just put some quote there. So there are some states which have some restriction of soil, movement of soil, or how they treat plants and things like that, and it is mostly due to transporting cocoons, if not the worms, then the cocoons of the worms. So with that, thank you very much. I put two papers in. They are very general papers. If somebody wants to know more about the jumping worms or how to collect them or how to study them, there are two resources here, but there's a lot more. So thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. If you can unshare, come back and we'll put a spotlight on you.
Sure.
And then if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. You can raise your hand and ask directly. I'll call on you. We go back here. Justine asked, did you do research at Oregon Ridge, and wanted to know if you found anything there?
Yes, we did research on Oregon Ridge. Oregon Ridge, you find them in Oregon Ridge. They're especially in the upper regions. So we found there's a lot of European earthworms along the stream, and then a lot of jumping worms. I mean, we mostly go in the yellow trail from the back, Beaver Dam Road, and then hike up there. And yeah, they were definitely there. There were also native species along the stream, so if that's a good thing, I don't know.
Nala asked that you showed the species that people used to think invaded America from Europe until genetic evidence showed that they were closer to the American species. Any idea when and how they came to Europe from the Americas?
How they came from Europe and when? So yes, we do have ideas. There are some records of them. Well, again, the most efficient way of transporting soil organisms is by soil, transporting large amounts of soil. So in the early days, the ships have soil and not water as a ballast material. So the ships came from Europe empty, and they went back with all the goodies, all the trees, and lumber, and so forth. So there had to be a lot of ballast material. This ballast material was then brought to the port cities, and then they were shoveled onto the shore because you didn't want to fill up the ports with sediment. So they were shoveled onto the shore, and then boom, there were a lot of soil organisms there. And so some of them were definitely introduced and potentially spread from those. The other one is that people brought their plants. The immigrants brought their little plants in pots, some of them small, some of them larger. So a lot of organisms got introduced this way. And then the third is plant exchanges. Again, probably you know that, maybe history better than I do. There were a lot of plant exchanges. People were sent around and bringing things to greenhouses and arboretums and, exotic plants and things like that. That's another great way of introducing organisms. So that brings organisms into the coast. And then from there, obviously often transport happens by tires. Cocoons get stuck in the tires, in the soil, and got moved around, or people move them around. The one, again, not confirmed story is that the Dutch settlers maybe intentionally brought them from the Netherlands to Manhattan because they didn't have them. So again, just remember, north of these glacial lines, there are no native earthworms. And so they wanted to garden and they didn't see earthworms. They knew that earthworms are good, so they brought some in. And I don't know where this story is coming from, but we can believe it. It's believable.
Whoa, that's interesting. Okay, we got to blame the Dutch. All right, then we have now T. Lehman, you had your hand up. Do you still have a question that you want to ask?
Thank you. Yes, I'm curious about a question and a half. Once, there are studies that suggest that some of the earthworm-eating birds are infected with particular pathogens, for example, Toxoplasma gondii, who, many stages, I don't know if they are called oocysts or otherwise, are being released and potentially could be vehicles for infection of other organisms, maybe not only for whoever eats them. So I'm curious about what are the roles of this earthworm in changing patterns of infection in vertebrates, for example?
So are you asking whether or not the earthworms can be intermediate hosts of certain pathogens or parasites? Is that...
Or carriers, not necessarily the ones that would facilitate development of these pathogens, but they could harbor them and create basically the mechanism to infect birds, which then can infect.
So I haven't studied that. I wouldn't be surprised if the answer is yes. I know for isopods, we talked about isopods last time. The isopods, for instance, are intermediate host of certain
Nematodes?
Acanthocephalon, oh God, hookworms, is it hookworm?
Yes.
I don't know. So anyway, certain parasites of birds. And so these forms or these life forms in the intermediate host actually changes the behavior of the intermediate host. So for instance, isopods, they don't like to be out in the open because they get picked up by the worms or by the birds and or other their predators. But these parasites make them wandering around in the open, and so this is how they get transmitted. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like that is the case, but I don't know, honestly.
Thank you. Fascinating. Really wonderful talk.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. And you mentioned that the Asian earthworms overwintered as the cocoon, but that some of the earthworms had different life histories. Could you just explain the different life histories that some of the earthworm groups?
So in the European worms, they live for many years. You know, that's another question, how many years, but several years. In a lab, a night crawler, you can keep it alive if you feed it well for 8 years. I mean, in the nature, they usually don't. So the one thing about these European worms, they are, they like the cool temperature, 10, 12 degrees. So they don't like this hot summer. So they pretty much, they may be slow, but they kind of still active. When it gets really cold or really hot and or dry, they just go deeper into the soil. So they overwinter in the deeper areas. When it gets really dry, then they knock themselves, they make a knot of them, they tie themselves into a knot. They stop feeding. They produce a certain little thin shell of polysaccharides. And so to prevent water loss, because they obviously don't have impermeable, I guess, anything. And so they stop feeding and they wait until the rain comes and then they sort of reactivate themselves. Sometimes this is even obligatory. This summer diapause, certain species is genetically controlled, and so even when the conditions are nice and moist, they doing it. But generally, winter time they are in the deeper soil.
Okay, wonderful. Alec asked, what makes the soil in the uncut forest patches inhospitable to earthworms, and if they interpreted that correctly?
So one of the things is it's extremely acidic. That's the one thing that earthworms don't like. The pH is sort of 3.8, 4. That's really not good for them. But the other one, unfortunately, I don't know, it's an isolated. So one of them is on an island and the other one is in a peninsula. So it's somewhat physically isolated from the rest of it, but it is very, very acidic.
Okay. Roland asks, what problems do the jumping worms cause, especially for wild landscapes or native plant gardens? And are they the only ones to be concerned of? And if they identify it, what do you do with it?
Okay, so people ask that. I give talks at the Native Plant Society, and the plant people think about this differently. They think that, okay, we go out with our trowel and whatnot and pull out all these invasive things and we solve at least temporarily the problem. You cannot do that with things that move around or small and so on. So the one thing I would mention, two actually. One is that one of the most efficient way of spreading earthworm is via mulch. We are religiously mulching everything in our gardens and parks and everywhere. And even, you have a trail in a forest, you mulch it so that people don't have to walk around on the mud. And so mulch is often full of these cocoons, and people have shown this. And so this is a great way of, spreading them into places you normally don't want to. Once you have them, so the compost, so the Asian ones doing very well in compost. And so very high temperature is what, and I cannot say the top of my head how high the temperature has to be, but you can Google it and you can find some numbers. So if you can heat up your compost, you kill the worms and the cocoons as well. So that's one way. But other than that, unfortunately, nothing. For a long time, we thought that, okay, these earthworms the Asian ones are feeding on leaf litter, so not a big problem in grasslands or your lawn. It looks like they can get underneath the lawn, and there are some studies from Cornell that even they eat the roots of the grassy areas and the thatch, so you can lift them up like a carpet or something, and underneath will be these worms. I haven't seen them here, but that's what I was told. So, yeah, I mean, essentially, again, the major effect is changing the forest floor with disappearing leaf litter, disappearing organic matter. And so that is what have effects on other members of the soil biota or the understory vegetation. And that goes probably for native plant gardens as well.
Alan, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
So 2 questions. I probably am poor listener and I've missed some like basic stuff that you may have said, but just in general, a description of how they reproduce, sort of the reproduction process. And number 2, I know you've shared a lot of detail on a lot of different things in this one area, but maybe to help me understand it, what would we see that would be different if there were no earthworms at all on the earth? Would there be something we would, would there be some manifestation we would notice? So those are my 2 big questions from bad listening.
Yeah. Okay, first reproduction. So most earthworms are hermaphrodites, so they have both the male and female organ. And so they essentially mate and exchange sperm. And so one of the photos I showed, they kind of come together like this. So if you go out in April in the evening, these big night crawlers come out of their burrows. They look for each other. They will match themselves up. So they have 2 holes. One is where they give the sperm, and the other one where they receive the sperm as they move apart. And so this is why these reproductive organs are characteristics that we use to distinguish species, because this is happening in certain places on the body, in certain segments. And so they have to really fit together in order to the sperm exchange take place.
So when I hear hermaphrodite, I usually think of like it's fertilizing itself, but this is almost no, that's wrong.
No, hermaphrodites don't. No, they hermaphrodites means that they have both the male and the female reproductive organs. Now and there might be some organisms that maybe plants, I don't know, but earthworms don't do that. What they do, as many of the Asian ones and some of the Europeans, is they can be parthenogenetic. That means that there is no exchange, nothing. It's just cloning themselves. So it's just basically the individual produce genetic equivalent of themselves. So they don't need any of that. Now what was the second question?
If there were no earthworms.
Yeah. It would be very different, obviously. I mean, they move so much, where they are active in places, they move so much soil. So I just looked this up for a proposal I'm writing, is that about the upper, I don't know, 15, 20 centimeter, where you have lots of earthworms, gets turned over every 10 years completely. It goes through their gut system. So it's just hard to say how the soil would be very different. It would have a different structure. It would have different microorganisms. They have a very rich gut microbiome, which does all kinds of decomposition. The biogeochemistry would be different. How the water moves into the soils would be different because they produce different kinds of burrows and so on. Again, these mixing things, and they've been doing this for a long, long time, is super important. Now, again, as I mentioned, somewhere in Canada, okay, which was glaciated. So even if they had earthworms, which we don't know if they did, the forest evolved without earthworms. And so again, that reflects on the forest soil structure and the rest of the fauna. Of course, those are very thin, very extremely thin soils. So I think they are, at least in the temperate region, in mesic systems, they are a key player in soil formation.
So this is, oh, thank you. And this is my last, this is becoming my standard question. How did you get interested in earthworms?
So I got my education in Hungary, and I was part of a soil zoology group. I showed you my colleague and my professor, and they are the earthworm taxonomists. And so I actually got the roly-polies, the isopods. They gave you a group. You didn't have a choice. So I got the roly-polies. You have to work on that. You have to study them. You have to, study their ecology and taxonomy and things. So I started out with that. And so, but I learned a lot about earthworms by working with this group. Other people were studying millipedes or fly larvae or potworm, little white enchytrade worms or nematodes. And so when I came to the US, that's when I became aware of this invasive problem. I was not aware of this at all. Like I said, knowing the history in Europe has a lot longer history. And so it's a lot more difficult to untangle, what people were coming and going, and there are all kinds of events taking place. But here is very clear. This is this continent, or this part of the continent, where we know when the Europeans came over. We also know they were Native Americans and things, but certainly these massive agriculture practices changed the landscape. And so I got fascinated by that, and this is how I started studying them. And I'm still collaborating with people in Europe because they know a lot more about natural history and taxonomy.
Thank you. Wonderful. Passionate. That's great.
Thanks.
And Kathleen, and I think that she probably shares this question with a whole bunch of people, and especially me. How do you get one of your kits? Because we want to be participate in the community science effort and help move your research forward.
Yeah, so I have a few hundred of them, and now ready to go. So the best time to do this is somewhere April, May. So I'm getting ready to distribute them. I don't know if this group going ever to the museum, or I'm happy to just drop a whole bunch of them over there. Or you can email me. The last slide is my email, and then when the time comes in a month or so, I will need your address. I can send you one, and then you can send me back one, and I will be very grateful for it.
Okay, I think we're gonna work on that. We can definitely take a whole bunch and have them at the museum for distribution.
Okay, sounds good.
Timothy says, is the success of invasive plants in the U.S. in part due to the presence of invasive earthworms? You kind of covered that a
little. There are studies that showing that. So there are studies that show that where there is an invasive buckthorn, I think, or buck something, some shrubby thing, has a lot more earthworms. So the idea being is that they are synergistic in terms of their success. It's really hard though to separate this effect from the fact that invasive things are usually do well in disturbed environment. So edges, for instance, right, the stewed grass or a lot of other things, the basket, what's it called, basket weave, something. A lot of these things are often do not enter into the deep forest. They're doing very well in the edges or these disturbed transitional, you know, part of habitats or part of ditches and so on. And so it could be a combination of the two. There are also papers which show that no, they do not sort of accelerate or they do not work together that way. So it's hard to know.
Jillian asks, is there any research being done in Japan to see what constrains the populations of the jumping worms where they're native?
There are a few people working, but they were not really interested in these species. But I think that there are efforts between American scientists and Japanese scientists to look at their genetics, you know, how they might be different genetically. We know that there are some morphological differences. The ones in here are, at least certain species are bigger. As I said, they live several years over there. They are annual here, which is fascinating. Yeah, I think there are some, they try to sort of compare the populations here and there. But yeah, that's all I can say.
Richard asks, in the eastern US, what percentage of earthworms are invasive versus the native species?
So the native species, the further south you go, the higher the diversity of native species are. So there is a lot of in Texas and you know, in southern states, there are lots and lots, Florida, lots of native species. So I don't know the percentage there. I know, like I said, this native group, the Diplocardia, is not very well studied. So in Maryland, I can tell you that the invasive species are probably making, as we know today, making up about 70–80% of the earthworms. But you know, it hasn't been there are a lot of places that haven't been explored, so these numbers might change. But definitely here, and the further you know, the invasive non-native species are dominating. And as I mentioned, above the glacier line, that's all you get. In the northern states, Michigan and Wisconsin, and further up in Canada and New England, that's all non-native species.
And then you have a few questions that are kind of in the same vein. Is there a way to combat the invasive earthworms, or what should we do about this? And are they causing harm, or should we just not worry about them?
So I don't think we can slow down things, right? We can with these restricting movement of soil, movement of mulch, and selling or exchanging plants which are only bare root. That helps a little bit. Other than that, once they are somewhere, I don't think. In your backyard, like I said, if you heat up your compost or your mulch, you can kill them. Some people just collect them and kill them. So if you do it very early on, in the, say, June, before they mature, maybe you can at least control to some extent the populations. But they're coming, you know, they're coming everywhere. So.
Well, one of the ways is to get involved with a community science project, and you can be part of the research and being the answers to some of these questions.
Yeah, at least we need to know where they are. And I have to say that a lot of this concern is sort of bottom up. So it always came from gardeners, master gardeners or garden clubs who wanted to know what they are. But you can go to nurseries and lift up those geotextiles or whatever. There will be, very likely, there will be there. We cannot spray. People try this and that, burning. They tried putting sulfur, some kind of sulfur on the surface, and that they don't like it. But I mean, do we want to do that really, or no? So it's just not a good way to combat that.
And Christine, I'll send an email out when we get the kits, and I'll send an email out to everybody who registered for this talk and let you know that the kits are in, if you want to come pick one up, or you can just go ahead and communicate directly. Are there predators?
Well, so this is the thing, right? So we love our birds, don't we, in our garden? We love our robins, and their main food is earthworms. So that's another good question. What was the bird population like before, you know, all this was happening? So certainly the European earthworms are the best food in the springtime. Yeah, not just for the ground living birds. It's very high in proteins and energy, and so it's great to feed your nestlings. The Asian birds, a little bit, it's a big question mark. So they are more difficult to catch because they are wiggling and jumping. That's kind of a way. I personally haven't seen a lot of birds feeding on them. Some people say they maybe their slime might be slightly toxic. So we really don't know that. But even if they are predators, they are not keeping up. So it's usually, if you have a big invasive, you know, like big population, it's not the predators. As one of your listeners said, maybe some diseases could take care of them if they have. But often, or sometimes, these invasive species may not bring their own pathogens with them. And so that's another sort of way of being successful in a new environment.
Sarah asks, the 70 or 80% earthworms, I thought you said that the 70 to 80% were native, not invasive. Was that, did I hear that wrong?
So the 70–80% are the non-native species, as we know, and that's just species. That's just species number. Native species are not very abundant, so that's another question of what the world around here would be. So there are places still, especially if we go to Pennsylvania, where there are no non-native earthworms. You find the native earthworms, but they're very low abundance. They are here and there, and they are very thin. If they living in the soil, they look like a piece of wire. They're not this pink, you know, wormy thing. Or they live in specialized environments, such as wetlands or under tree barks, decaying tree barks and things like that. So they're not visible and not abundant and not significant in terms of processing leaf litter or moving soil and turning over soil. So the 70–80% is the number of species which are non-native. Not all of them are invasive, so I don't want to mix up the two. So a species can be non-native, but very rare. Invasiveness happens when they change something about the environment to, well, depending on where you look at it, but let's say in a negative, they have a profound way of affecting how that previous how this habitat worked. There are species which are non-native, but they are very small, very thin, or very relatively rare. So not all of them are invasive. And I don't know what percent, yeah. Mostly dominated by the first wave, yes, not the second. But again, I don't know about Western Maryland. I haven't looked around there.
But the second wave, the Asian ones are coming on strong. You're saying
They're coming on strong, yes.
And then the last question we have is, sometimes we see earthworms crawling in dry areas outside during the day. Are they healthy or infected with something?
I don't know. I honestly don't know the question. Based upon what I just said about isopods, maybe they are infected, or yeah, I really don't know. So they mostly come out when it's really wet, or at night, to the surface. Obviously, that's a safer environment for them, because they won't be picked up by predators. And if they come out when there is really dry, then they're just gonna dry out. So that's kind of it's a sort of a natural selection, right? So
Well, what we know is that we have more questions than we have answers. So there's a lot more science to be done, and we can go out there and start being a part of that. So thank you so much, Dr. Szlavecz, for coming and sharing your knowledge and expertise with us tonight on earthworms. I wonder what you're going to teach us next. I can't wait. And everybody, thank you for joining us. Stay
thank
well.
you. Thank you again for spending your evening with me, and let me know if you have any questions, and we'll keep in touch about the kits then.
That was just as
Wonderful.
interesting as the roly-polies, even more, in fact. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.